The spiritual industry has sold you a beautiful lie that raising your frequency is about adding things, more gratitude, more meditation, more crystals on your altar. But Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, uncovered a terrifying truth that the wellness gurus pray you never discover. Most people chasing a higher vibration are actually running in place. They're using spirituality as the ultimate escape hatch from the one thing that would genuinely transform them. And this avoidance doesn't just stall their growth, it traps them in the very frequency they're desperately trying to escape. Jung spent a lifetime dissecting the psyche of those who claimed enlightenment, who spoke fluently about consciousness expansion. What he found was unsettling. Their spiritual practices weren't elevating them. They had become sophisticated armor, a way to feel evolved while staying psychologically asleep. They were still operating at the same base frequency, just dressed in nicer robes and armed with a vocabulary that sounded profound. Jung's revelation was this: true elevation, what we now call vibrating higher, isn't an accumulation. It's a stripping away. You don't rise by adding more to your soul. You rise by subtracting the psychological weights that anchor you to fear, wounding, and unconscious reaction. He identified 5 specific anchors, 5 things you must sever completely if you want genuine, not cosmetic, transformation. Not manage them better. Not balance them. Sever them. Today, we're going to dissect the 5 things Jung insisted you must surrender to actually change your frequency. We'll uncover why each one is a wolf in sheep's clothing, how clinging to them is the silent killer of your spiritual progress, and what life looks like on the other side of that release. Jung's entire map for what he called individuation, the process of becoming your true self, rested on a radical principle. Your natural state, your highest potential frequency, isn't something you build. It's something you uncover. It's like a diamond buried under layers of psychological rubble, childhood conditioning, societal programming, the scars of adaptation. You don't make the diamond shine brighter by painting it. You remove the dirt, and that dirt doesn't dissolve with positive affirmations. It requires a brutal, surgical release. He watched countless patients walk through his door, begging for change. They wanted to be more conscious, more whole. And Jung would ask them a single, devastating question: what are you prepared to lose to get it? Because everyone wanted the promised land, but nobody wanted to cross the desert to reach it. They wanted the upgrade without the deletion. They wanted to keep their comfortable stories, their familiar relationships, their safe identities. Jung knew this was a fantasy. Real change, a genuine shift in your being, demands a kind of psychological death. The person you were must end. The patterns you've worn like skin must be shed. And when people finally understand the true cost of elevation, the price of admission, most of them turn back. They stay with the rituals that make them feel like they're growing, while secretly protecting them from the fire of actual change. The first anchor you must sever is the addiction to appearing good. Jung called this the persona, the mask you wear to be acceptable, to buy love and avoid exile. And he was absolute. You cannot reach a high frequency while wearing a mask designed to make others comfortable. Think of the exhausting energy you burn managing your image, proving you're kind, that you're spiritual, that you're one of the good ones. You perform this role so relentlessly that you've lost touch with what you actually feel underneath. You swallow your anger because spiritual people don't get angry. You let your boundaries dissolve because conscious people are forgiving. You drain yourself being endlessly available because that's what good demands. Jung saw this performance of virtue as one of the lowest states you can inhabit. Why? Because it's rooted in pure terror. You aren't being good because goodness flows from you naturally. You're performing goodness to avoid the primal dread of being seen as bad, of being rejected and cast out. That fear, that constant, grinding vigilance about your image, keeps you buzzing at the frequency of survival, not sovereignty. Those who truly ascended, in Jung's observation, stopped performing and started being. And being authentic meant they could be both gentle and fierce, generous and uncompromising, compassionate and willing to confront. They reclaimed their full human spectrum, instead of squeezing themselves into the narrow band society labels good. This terrified the people around them. You can't manipulate someone who has dropped the good mask. You can't guilt them into compliance, because they're no longer auditioning for the role of good person. They've accepted that some people will think they're terrible, and they are finally at peace with that. Surrendering the need to be seen as good is the first breath of true freedom. But why is this so painful to release? Because your identity as the good one was likely your childhood survival strategy. Maybe you learned early that being good kept you safe, that performing kindness kept love from being withdrawn. Releasing that now feels like annihilation, because it is. The self built on that performance must die for the real you to be born. You'll know you've cut this anchor when you can disappoint someone and not crumble into shame. When you can be misunderstood and feel no urge to correct their perception. When someone calls you selfish and you feel steady in your own truth, regardless of their verdict. That internal steadiness, that's the frequency of authenticity. The second anchor you must sever is the compulsive need to be the healer. Jung studied what he termed the wounded healer, the person driven by an unrelenting need to fix, save, and mend others. And his finding was stark. This drive almost never comes from pure compassion. It comes from unhealed wounds within the healer. And it operates at a shockingly low frequency because it's about the healer's ego, not the other person's freedom. You've likely been told your empathy and desire to help is a gift. Jung would ask you to look deeper. Is your helping actually serving them? Or is it serving your need to feel valuable, needed, indispensable? Do you help those who ask? Or do you impose help on those who haven't, because you need the role of the helper? Jung saw that wounded healers are addicted to being needed. Their entire worth is built on others' dependency. So, unconsciously, they surround themselves with people who will never fully heal. Because if those people got well, the healer would lose their purpose. The helping wasn't about liberation. It was about maintaining an identity and avoiding their own pain. This pattern vibrates at the frequency of lack. You help because you feel empty without it. You heal because you're terrified to face your own wounds. You save because if everyone else was okay, you'd have to sit alone with your own unresolved darkness. So you stay busy, fixing everyone else, calling it service while it's really compulsion and avoidance. Those who genuinely vibrate higher have severed this compulsive helping. They can offer support when it's asked for and appropriate, but they aren't driven to rescue everyone they meet. They understand that everyone has their own path, that struggle is often the teacher, and that forced help is just control in disguise. Releasing this doesn't mean you become cold. It means you learn the difference between service and ego. It means accepting that your worth isn't tied to how many people need you. That sometimes, the most loving act is to let someone face their own storm and learn to build their own shelter. The hard part is that letting go of the healer feels like losing your reason for being. If you're not the one everyone runs to, who are you? If you're not needed, do you even matter? These questions are terrifying because they reveal your whole identity was built on a shaky foundation. You'll know you've cut this anchor when you can witness someone in pain and not feel the compulsion to rush in with solutions. When you can say, "That sounds incredibly hard," and leave it there. When you can care deeply without needing to control the outcome. That's the frequency of genuine compassion. Before we go deeper, if you're finding this framework resonant and want a practical path to apply these concepts, we've created something for you. It's called True Self-Discovery, a new guide filled with 24 practical reflection exercises directly inspired by Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you navigate the inner work we're discussing today. You can find the link to get True Self-Discovery in the description below. The third anchor you must sever is the desperate need to be understood. Jung called this one of the most subtly destructive patterns. Think of the energy you pour into making others get you, explaining your choices, defending your boundaries, justifying your feelings. This constant quest for external comprehension keeps you tethered to the frequency of validation when you should be operating from internal sovereignty. Add up the hours spent trying to make someone understand why you did something, why you feel a certain way. You have conversations where you explain yourself for an hour, searching for the right words they'll finally accept. And when they still don't get it, you feel crushed, invisible. So you try again, harder, hoping this time will be different. Jung saw this as a sign of a fundamental lack of self-trust. If you need others to validate your reality for it to feel real, you haven't yet built the internal authority required for high-frequency consciousness. You're outsourcing your sense of self to others' ability to comprehend you. And that outsourcing is dependence, which is a low-frequency state. People at a genuinely high frequency have released this need. They can share their experience, But they don't need you to understand it for it to remain true. They know what they know. They feel what they feel. And the absence of your comprehension doesn't shake their foundation. This is radical. Most people require a consensus reality. If others don't see what you see, you question your own sight. If others don't feel what you feel, you doubt your own feelings. You need their validation because you haven't yet learned to trust your own perception. Releasing this means accepting a painful truth. Most people will never understand you. They can't. They aren't living your life. They don't have your consciousness. And that's perfectly fine. You don't need their understanding. You need your understanding. Your relationship with your own truth must become so solid that it requires no external confirmation. Jung warned this release would feel isolating. Once you stop explaining, once you stop trying to translate yourself for others, many relationships built on that dynamic will dissolve. People will call you distant. But what's really happening is that you're clearing out relationships based on performance, making space for ones where you can simply be. You'll know you've cut this anchor when someone fundamentally misreads you, and you feel completely fine. When you can make a choice that baffles everyone else and feel stable in your knowing, despite their confusion. That internal stability is the frequency of self-sovereignty. The need to be understood is the cage of the self. Releasing it is the key. The fourth anchor you must sever is the fantasy of who people could become. Jung called this projection, seeing your own unrealized hopes in another person, and then relating to that fantasy instead of the real person standing in front of you. This is one of the most common traps that keeps people stuck in low-frequency patterns because it prevents you from seeing and responding to reality. You meet someone and you're captivated by their potential, who they could be if they just healed that wound, dropped that pattern, did the work. And you start a relationship with that imagined future person, not the actual human being right now. You stay with people who consistently hurt you because you can see the person they'd be if they changed. You offer endless chances to those who show you clearly who they are because you're convinced they could be someone different. Jung saw this pattern was about the projector, not the projected upon. You aren't seeing their potential. You're projecting your own unmet needs onto them. Maybe you need them to be safe so you can stop feeling afraid. Maybe you need them to be capable so you don't have to face your own powerlessness. Maybe you need them to change so you don't have to make the hard choice to leave. That need is yours. And you're using the fantasy of their potential to avoid dealing with the reality of who they are. This vibrates at a low frequency because it's based on denial. You are refusing to see what is right in front of you. You are living in a story about tomorrow to avoid dealing with the truth of today. And that denial keeps you locked in patterns that will never serve you because you're relating to ghosts, not humans. Those who elevate their consciousness have released projection. They see people clearly, exactly as they are in this moment, and they make decisions based on that reality, not on some potential future. This isn't pessimism, it's clarity. They can hope for change while accepting it may never come. And they refuse to sacrifice their present for a future that exists only in their mind. Releasing this fantasy is devastating because it means accepting that people you love may never become who you need them to be. The parent you've been waiting to see you, they probably never will. The partner you're convinced would be amazing if only, they probably won't do the work. They are who they are. And you've been loving a ghost. Jung said this release requires grief. You must mourn the person you hoped they'd become. You have to let that fantasy die so you can finally see the actual human and decide if that human, right now, is someone you want in your life. You'll know you've cut this anchor when you see someone's patterns and don't immediately start imagining how they could be different. When you believe their actions instead of overlaying your hopes onto them. That clarity is the frequency of truth. The fifth and final anchor is perhaps the most confronting. You must sever your identity as being wounded. Jung saw that people often build their entire personality around their trauma. And letting go of that feels like losing your entire self, because it is. The self built on the wound must die for the healed self to emerge. Now, healing absolutely requires acknowledging your wounds, understanding their impact, feeling the pain. That is essential. But Jung saw that many people get stuck here. They understand their trauma perfectly. They can recite its history, but they remain identified as the wounded one. They introduce themselves through their pain. They connect with others through shared victimhood. Their whole identity orbits around what was done to them. Jung observed that this identification keeps you locked in what he called victim consciousness. Not as a judgment, but as a description. It means your entire orientation is determined by the past, by what happened to you. Your choices, your relationships, your way of being are all filtered through that wound identity. And that filter keeps you operating at the low frequency of unhealed trauma, even if you've done years of work. Genuine elevation requires you to release that identity. It doesn't mean denying the harm. It means no longer organizing your existence around it. It means integrating the experience without being defined by it. Becoming someone who has those experiences, but is not those experiences. This is one of the hardest asks because being wounded comes with hidden benefits. People are gentler with you. Your struggles are explained. You have a reason for your pain. You belong to a community of others who share your wounds. Releasing this means giving up those benefits and standing alone as someone responsible for their life now, regardless of what came before. Jung warned that many people resist this because, unconsciously, they are more invested in being right about their wound than in actually healing. They want the validation that they were hurt, that it wasn't their fault. And they will stay wounded forever to keep receiving that validation, rather than step into the terrifying unknown of simply being responsible for who they become now. Releasing the wounded identity means your trauma is no longer the headline of your life. It's a chapter, not the whole book. You carry the scars, but you aren't defined by them. You'll know you've cut this anchor when your past isn't the most interesting thing about you. When you can connect with others without bonding over shared pain. When you're more curious about who you're becoming than you are about explaining why you are the way you are. That forward orientation is the frequency of creation. Here is the core of Jung's discovery about these 5 releases. Most people never make them, because each one requires a death, not a metaphor, an actual psychological death of an identity you've worn for years. And human beings will do almost anything to avoid death, even psychological death. So they stay at low frequencies, doing all the spiritual things that make them feel like they're growing, while secretly protecting the very patterns that keep them stuck. They meditate, but they keep performing goodness. They do healing work, but they stay compulsively attached to the helper role. They read philosophy, but they still need everyone to understand them. They go to therapy, but they keep projecting fantasies onto others. They do inner child work, but they refuse to drop the identity of the wounded child. None of it creates real change, because they are adding practices while refusing to subtract the patterns. They are trying to fly while clinging to the weights that chain them to the ground. And Jung would say this: it will never work. You cannot vibrate higher while holding on to the things that define the lower frequencies. Something has to die. 5 somethings, in fact. If you are serious about elevating your consciousness, Jung's map is clear. Sever the need to be seen as good and step into authenticity. Sever the compulsion to heal everyone and step into discernment. Sever the attachment to being understood and step into self-trust. Sever the fantasy of who people could be and step into clear sight. Sever your identity as wounded and step into integration. Each severance will feel like dying, because parts of you that have existed for decades will end. The self you knew will dissolve, and there will be a terrifying void where the old you is gone and the new you hasn't fully arrived. Jung called this the necessary darkness, and it is in that void, that space between death and rebirth, that genuine transformation occurs. But what becomes possible on the other side? You operate from authenticity, not performance. You serve from genuine compassion, not ego need. You trust your own knowing, not the validation of others. You see reality clearly, not through a filter of fantasy. You stand as someone responsible for who you are becoming, not someone defined by who you were. That stance, that orientation, is what vibrating higher actually means. It was never about the crystals, the sage, or the affirmations. Those things are decorations. The real work is release, surrender, death. Giving up the patterns, identities, and stories that keep you trapped in low-frequency consciousness, even while you're sitting on your meditation cushion. Jung's message was brutally simple. You want to vibrate higher? Stop trying to accumulate light and start removing the blocks. These 5 things: performed goodness, compulsive helping, the need for understanding, fantasy projection, and the wounded identity. These are the weights. Cut them loose. Watch them fall. Grieve who you were when you carried them. And discover who you actually are when you're finally free. That is the real path. Not feeling peaceful while your patterns remain intact. but becoming someone fundamentally different through the courage to release what no longer serves. Someone who has died to who they were and emerged as who they actually are. That transformation is possible, but only if you are willing to give up these 5 things completely. Not manage them, not modify them. Give them up, let them die, and discover what emerges on the other side. That is Jung's framework. That is the real price of admission to a higher frequency. And it costs you everything you've been clinging to, in exchange for a freedom you've never known. If this video resonated and you're ready to start your own deep work, please like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more explorations into the psychology of transformation. And don't forget to check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, link below.